This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. In this country, we are often told that racism has been the cause of many things. It was the cause of slavery. It was the cause of segregation. And now it's the cause of police brutality and mass incarceration. Now, my guests this week were among the first people to teach me many, many years ago that this way of thinking not only betrays a terrible ignorance of history, it also prevents the kind of coalition politics that's necessary to end things like slavery, to stop things like segregation, and to put an end to police violence and mass incarceration. This is my interview with the historians Barbara J. Fields and Adam Rothman. I am joined today by two very special guests for me. They mean a lot to me personally in my life. People I have known for decades. I'm joined by Adam Rothman from Washington, D.C., who's a professor of history at Georgetown University, and Barbara J. Fields of Columbia University, who I'm going to start talking about because I met you first, and I have to tell a story, Barbara, about you that I've never told you. I've never told many people, actually. So when I entered Columbia, that was 1991. I began graduate school in the history department. You were a professor there then, and you were talked about quite a bit. We were all very, very aware of you. And I will say, I know I was, and I think many of us were intimidated by you. And the main reason was that we just simply thought you were the most brilliant person there. And I didn't know why. And you gave a talk to Alan Brinkley's, what was it? There was a seminar that was given to all first-year graduate students we had to take. Adam, what was it called? The Brinkley seminar? Where we got like an introduction to the profession, and it was a historiography.
Yeah, I think they used to call it literature of American history.
That's it. Yeah. So
it's not called that anymore.
Right.
It's a lovely title, though. The literature of American history.
It is.
If only.
It's appropriately genteel for an Ivy League school. Yeah. But
it fooled people. People tried to enroll in it who thought it was a literature course.
When it was really just like sort of an introduction to this profession you all are now entering. And
right.
Alan, my great recently passed advisor, Alan Brinkley, brought into that course guest speakers who were mostly from the department faculty, and you were one of them. And you gave a talk. I remember the scene. I can even remember the classroom. I couldn't tell you what number of the classroom, but I can see this. And I didn't know anything about you. And you stood up, sat there and told us that race wasn't real. And I thought, this is a long time ago, so don't hold it against me. I thought at that time, you were said
this is nonsense.
I thought it was nonsense. And I thought, but worse, I thought you were some sort of self-hating black person, because no self-respecting black person would ever make such an argument. I had never read a word of your work. I didn't know anything from anything. But people kept, and then Michael Zakim, Adam and our colleague, Adam was a graduate student a couple of years later there. And Michael was in my cohort. He was in that class. He was in that room with me, and a really brilliant guy. Like Adam and Michael to me were like really the most interesting graduate students there when I was there.
Low bar, Thad.
Hey, now we're talking about our colleagues.
I know.
But
You should be more respectful.
But Michael said at one point, I ran into him in the library in Butler, and he said, I just read Fields' essay. I said, what is this? He said, yeah, it's next level. It's like not, and I said, whoa, what's this? So I tracked it down, and this is before the internet. This is before JSTOR. This is before all that. This is 1991, the fall of 1991. Your article, for some reason, the big, the good, the better one, the New Left, or the more fully fleshed out one, a New Left Review, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's called Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America. If you go through U.S. history grad school without ever reading that, you have not gotten a real education. You should not be teaching American history. It's a classic article, considered by almost everyone in our field. So I went to the law school, which is the only place I could get that, and I sat down. I remember the chair I was sitting in, and I sat down and I read that article. And I grew up in Berkeley to leftist Marxist parents, and I was surrounded by left, and I lived in Manhattan then, and I never thought once anything other than, oh, there are different races of people and they are biologically determined, and this means a whole lot about black people and white people and whoever else. And I remember the feeling I had by the time I got through your article. I felt like the whole world was upside down. I remember walking down Amsterdam Avenue, which is where the law school was, just in this sort of daze. Like my life had changed, Barbara. And you know what? It did. Like that article was so formative for me in my own intellectual development. And I have been citing it, teaching it every year, every semester, practically every month since 1991, Professor Fields.
Well, this is very flattering.
Well, it is very true. And you can ask anybody at Renegade University. I have mentioned you a zillion times. You can talk to all my political friends who I keep telling, you must read Barbara Fields. You must read Barbara Fields. And it's, we'll get into the argument of that brilliant, there's actually two articles or two different versions of the same article, essentially, which then I think you would agree got sort of fully fleshed out with your book, Racecraft, right, in 2012, I guess, or at least many of the arguments in it, right?
Well, and I was joined by my sister, and
right.
It turned out that while we weren't necessarily even talking to each other, we had both been thinking along similar lines. But I guess we'll be talking about that later.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll get into that very soon. Okay, so then Adam, now I'm going to say some nice things about you. As I said, like you were the golden boy of our department, which wasn't always easy for me, by the way. You know, I have to say, when you got your job at Georgetown, I had a moment there. It was tough for me. And your job talk, and we will talk about your book, which was your dissertation, Slave Country. You know, I gave you this really pointed. It was a good question. It was a really pointed question, which I will admit now was partly motivated by a little bit of envy there. I just will say that, you know, and you were a little bit annoyed at me, but you're right to be. We're talking about ancient history here.
Yeah.
Coming out now, but no, Adam is you were pretty much the only other grad student there who, on a regular basis, would correct me about things I would say. I remember saying something. That
must have been really annoying.
Well, I deserved it. Because I thought I was the great. You know, I thought I was Mr. Brilliant. And I remember saying once something like, Thaddeus Stevens was the classic bourgeois. And you said, well, what about his redistribution plans? I was like, oh, Jesus, Adam. Like, you just completely crushed me. But yeah, you were very sharp, and this is why you got the job, and this is why you wrote a brilliant dissertation on the expansion of slavery into Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, which is at that point, your book came out in 2007. Your dissertation was written when? Like in much earlier than
2000, yeah.
2000, yeah, right. Was the first time anybody had really examined that process, and sort of people, I think, had generally assumed that there was always like the South, and it was always unified, and it always included those states, which are considered classic Deep South states now. So then, and I will then finally get to talk to you guys in a second, I just want to introduce all of this and why I have you on. Then the reason you're on now, even though I've wanted to have both of you on the show for a very long time, is that Adam, was it a couple weeks ago, sent me your article that you both co-authored in Dissent magazine about the death of a woman named Hannah Pfizer in Missouri. a white woman
Yes.
who was shot to death by the police, who was unarmed, and you make an argument that I've been making extremely as loud as I can for ever since 2014 and Ferguson and Mike Brown and Black Lives Matter erupted, which is that, for me, the basic argument is that a whole lot of white people, a whole lot of white people, are getting killed and incarcerated, and they are basically ignored. And because they are basically ignored by the movement, which makes it all about race and not about state power, not about police brutality, not about prisons, but about race, we cannot form a coalition, an effective coalition among the victims, the white victims of police violence and incarceration, and the black victims, and not to speak of the brown victims who are also ignored, which is outrageous, of police violence and mass incarceration. And therefore, we're never going to get real reform. And you guys make this argument in this article, which is stunning, because I didn't even think about this. You said, you know who made a coalition to make some serious change in this country? It was the Republican Party in the 1850s, which brought together all sorts of people, some of whom were outright racists, anti-black racists, but to fight the slave states for various reasons. Now, do you want to lay out your argument? I kind of did it was a very schematic job there, but why don't you guys get into the argument of that article and flesh it out for us? Because there's a lot of brilliant stuff in there, and your use of history and that particular historical example, I just think is so powerful. But why don't you get into it?
You want to start, Adam?
Sure. I think I'll start by just saying something about Hannah Pfizer's story.
Yeah.
I can't even remember how I came across it. It was probably on Twitter or something like that. And I just started reading about it in local, you can read local newspapers online from anywhere now. So I think it was like the Sedalia Democrat or something. I never heard of this paper, but they were really the only ones who were covering it. And they told this story that was absolutely shocking about a young woman who's driving to work at a convenience store late on a Saturday night, gets pulled over by the police, I think for running a red light, ends up dead. The police report that was reported in the paper said that she had been non-compliant, and had maybe threatened the police officer with a gun. But no gun was found in the car. And of course, she can't tell her side of the story because she's dead. And it wasn't getting a whole lot of attention. It didn't go viral. There's no video or anything. But she's white. And, it's the kind of story that we've heard a lot, and mostly about black people, because black people there's a lot of them getting shot. But I just started to think, why isn't this story getting the same kind of attention? It really is shocking. Another example of an unarmed person getting killed by the police for what just seemed to be the flimsiest of reasons. So we started thinking about why that case wasn't getting the attention that it deserves, and then what the implications might be of actually paying attention to a case like that, and the opportunities to open up a potentially more successful kind of movement to actually curtail these sorts of horrific crimes. And so the article really starts from thinking about what it would mean to take Hannah Pfizer's life and death seriously.
And I have to say, too, that it brought back to mind a young man in a small town. I don't remember the name any longer. Young white guy in a small town in South Carolina who was also shot dead by the police. Same sort of thing. Nobody could figure out why. He was not armed. And the story usually is somebody smart-mouthed the officers, and then the officers killed him. And that one, as I remember, occurred around the same time as Philando Castile. My sister and I actually mentioned that case in an article that we wrote about that time, because that young man's family were more or less isolated in their small town. Their neighbors did not show any particular solidarity because, and this is a reflection of the very situation we're talking about, they couldn't really imagine a way that they could go against the police. It just didn't feel right to them to be saying something that was against the police. So, and they were embarrassed. How do they relate to the family of this young man when, as far as they're concerned, police brutality is something that has to do with Black people? And at that time, the only local people who showed any solidarity with the family were from the local Black Lives Matter organization. Their position was essentially, you see what we've been trying to tell you. And when Adam's the one who sent me a link to the story about Hannah Pfizer, my reaction was, why hasn't anybody made that same point now? Why are they not saying, see what we've been trying to tell you? It's not just us. As long as the police are allowed to do this to us, they're going to be out of control, period.
I love that the local Black Lives Matter people, was it South Carolina?
South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some small town, I can't remember where it was.
Right.
But they were the only ones who approached the family in solidarity.
I'm thrilled that any Black Lives Matter people would do that, because I'm sorry to say that I have not seen much of that from BLM. There's a guy I just interviewed for this show. His name is Michael Bell Sr., who is in actually Kenosha, Wisconsin, of all places. And his son was executed, actually, turns out, by the Kenosha police in 2004. And he's white. And his father, Michael Bell Sr., has been waging a 16-year campaign at this point for reform of police departments. And he's actually gotten 8 police departments across the country to institute independent review boards for the police to review cases like this, which they didn't before. They reviewed themselves. And they found themselves completely not guilty of executing his son when he was handcuffed and and actually pulled the trigger against his temple. It was clearly an execution. He won a reform settlement, but he won a settlement in court, a monetary settlement. But more importantly, he won these reforms. And he went to Soldier Field in Chicago and took a knee when Colin Kaepernick was doing that. And he got the local media to cover it. And he asked Colin Kaepernick through his lawyer, would you please just tweet out that the father of a son who was murdered by the Kenosha police is taking a knee at Soldier Field in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? And Colin Kaepernick ignored him. He said that he reached out to the entire King family, and the King family totally ignored him. He said he reached out to all the major Black Lives Matter leaders. They totally ignored him. Oprah has ignored him. He's been doing this for 16 years, and he's been doing it successfully too, which is especially concerning. He's not just yelling. So there's actually, I'm sorry to say, but this shouldn't be surprising to you that Black Lives Matter as a movement has made this issue entirely about race. On the discourse is entirely that it's all about race.
I don't even know that you can call it a movement. It's certainly a mobilization.
Yeah.
But would you say a movement? Because the point you've just made indicates that it's not a movement in the sense of analyzing the problem, getting to the root of it, and figuring out where it comes from.
Right.
And that was what Adam and I had been thinking about before he sent me that article about Hannah Pfizer. We had been talking about the way the overweening actions of the authorities was making a lot of white people look at what was going on and saying, we have a stake in this too. And the Battle of Lafayette Square, which we called it in the article, was one of the ways, because there you see the utmost force of the police being brought to bear against people peacefully demonstrating, clergy members, and most of them were white. And to us, it brought to mind the way the slave power, as it came to be known, overreached during the 1840s and 50s in ways that convinced a lot of white people who were not particularly anti-slavery, certainly were not abolitionists, but convinced them that their rights were threatened by the slave power. And so we were saying, well, it looks as though what's going on here might be the same, potentially anyway, the same process in which overreaching by the authorities serves as a way of recruiting an opposition to them among people who aren't the natural, at least in our sort of political setup. You don't think of them as the natural opponents.
Exactly.
And so we thought this is what we need to build on politically.
Yeah.
So you might, to put it another way, you could say, people who might not necessarily be naturally inclined to side with Black Lives Matter or to be concerned about Black people getting shot and killed by police, become concerned when they see people peacefully protesting getting beat up and knocked down and tear gassed by those police, when they see, people they recognize brutalized in that kind of way. And so that forges a kind of, it radicalizes people, and it forges the basis for a potential alliance and for a new kind of politics.
Absolutely. Can you guys talk about, Adam, why don't you talk about the specific ways in which the so-called slave power, that's what it was dubbed in the 1850s by Republicans and abolitionists. What were the Southern states doing politically that was infringing on the civil liberties and rights of Northerners?
Yeah. I think before we get into that political process, I think you have to recognize that the abolitionist movement, as it had emerged in the 1820s and 1830s, was really a fringe movement. I mean, they're a small group of Black and white Northerners who have this just moral passion, religious passion to fight against slavery. They believe slavery is a sin and that it's brutalizing. But they are unpopular and politically impotent, basically. So the question is, how do those activists germinate a movement that essentially creates a new and successful political party by the 1850s? How do they expand that politics?
Yes.
And so, as Barbara pointed out, a lot of it is accomplished by the overreaching of the so-called slave power itself. And a lot of it has to do with the ways that those who are defending the interests of slave owners infringe on the rights of free white Northerners in defense of their own interests. So, for example, beginning in the 1830s, abolitionists generate a long series of petitions to Congress to protest different aspects of slavery and suggest different kinds of policies that might rein in slavery. And first the House and then the Senate basically decides to immediately table any petition having to do with slavery, not even discuss it. The abolitionists and growing anti-slavery forces cast this as an infringement on the basic American political right of petition. Like, whatever you think about slavery, people should have a right to petition their government. And that was being trampled by the so-called gag rule. That sort of dynamic repeats itself over and over and over. Another classic example is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which basically strengthens the enforcement or the recovery and rendition of fugitive slaves who had made it to the North to the South. I mean, this is actually authorized by the Constitution. But the way that law worked out in practice, it basically compelled free white Northerners to be slave catchers. And even those who weren't that fond of slavery didn't want to be complicit in it in that way and resented the expansion of federal authority that law represented. And so they see it as another example of the overreaching of the slave power. So they begin to see the ways that slavery endangers not just the slaves, but themselves. And that is motivating.
And let me also mention the Dred Scott decision.
Yes.
Which most people who are at least halfway educated, know, ended up saying that Black people can't possibly be citizens. But another thing that it did that was very important in the minds of a number of white Northerners was it essentially closed off any possibility of white people saying, we don't want slavery in our state, in our local area, whatever political jurisdiction they controlled,
Right.
because the decision essentially said, if you do that, you're infringing on property rights, and you can't do that. So that not only would rile people who just happen to believe in the Constitution and the law, but also people who do not want Black people to be where they're living.
Right.
And if they don't have the right to say slaveholders can't bring their slaves here, then they don't have the ability to say this is going to be a white territory.
That's right.
So that's one of the reasons, one of the ways that racism could even be one of the motivations behind building the Republican Party. First, building the free soil movement, out of which the Republican Party grew.
Right.
So some motives that don't actually look that good when you examine them can actually be part of a political process.
That's right.
Leading to the ending of slavery.
That's right. Actual racists. I mean, by anybody's standard, they were racist. Turned out to be very important parts of this coalition. And
sort of people who forbade Black people to migrate to Oregon and Oregon Territory, California.
Because they believed that the slave power of the South, with some justification, might very well, and this is kind of goes to Adam's work and something, might very well expand slavery into their very own states, which wasn't in their responses, just as you were saying, was not so much, oh my gosh, we're going to have slavery in the states, just we're going to have these Negroes in our state, and they didn't want that. That's what they didn't want. And so they were willing to join to fight the slave power, right? This reminds
I would add, could I add one thing? And
sure.
One of the interesting aspects of this is that as this anti-slavery coalition grows and coalesces into the Republican Party in the late 1850s, it poses a problem for the radical abolitionists who started the whole thing in the first place.
That's right.
Because a lot of the abolitionists, and we can talk about them later, a lot of them actually did believe in equality and the possibility of a biracial America and even possibly Black citizenship.
Yep.
And so they look at this emerging Republican Party and they're kind of aghast at what they've created.
Yeah.
Because they see the Republican Party is actually departing from some of the core egalitarian principles that they held on to. So it's amazing to see abolitionists in the 1850s having these intense debates about whether to support the Republican Party or not, whether somebody like Abraham Lincoln is their friend or their foe. And, those debates seem so timely today for anybody is like on the margins of the basic two-party system.
Right now, I'm writing a book about it's essentially a survey of U.S. foreign policy, American relations generally. But I found out, I didn't know this. I should have known this, I guess. But some of the leading opponents of imperialism in the late 19th century and early 20th century, with the Spanish-American War and the Philippines and Cuba, were Southern segregationists. Were outright racist because they knew that colonialism and imperialism ended up being a bridge which brings back these brown and Black people back into our country. And they didn't want our nice white soldiers mixing with those people in foreign lands and producing bastard children, etc. But, it's sort of like, but they were also the leading anti-imperialists and joined with the Anti-Imperialist League at the time.
They also saw another part of the motivation was that they saw it inevitably leading to an increase in the power of the central government.
Yes.
So they did, and they opposed that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very important. Now, you guys are making this argument about the Republican coalition. You reminded me, I don't know how much It's been a long time since I read it, but you reminded me of Eric Foner's great dissertation, which became his first book, 1969, was it? Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. Another classic in our field. And it's essentially that argument, isn't it? I mean, that book is about the ride, how the fear of slave power formed this Republican coalition, which really led to the Civil War. Right? I mean, that's what you're pointing to, isn't it? That argument.
Yeah. It has to be said that there's been a lot of scholarship about this.
Sure.
That may be eclipsed today, but about the essential racism of the free soil movement and people who lived in white people who lived in the Midwestern states and so on.
Right.
So Jacques Vogeli, for example, there was a whole literature in the late 60s about that.
Oh, Eric's was just one piece of that.
Yeah, well, an important piece of it. Yeah.
There have been so many unregistered customers of Paloma Verde CBD products that Paloma Verde, I think quite wisely, has re-upped their contract with us as our sponsor. I am thrilled because I love that company. It's owned and run by Carlos and Vanessa Abelar out of San Antonio, Texas. They are entrepreneurs to the bone. They built this business from nothing, from the ground up, and they've had lots of struggles doing that, in part because the banks wouldn't help them at all. They wouldn't give them loans or even accounts because they were a, quote, marijuana-related business. But Carlos and Vanessa persevered, and they've built a vibrant business that's doing wonderfully well. And best of all for us, they're giving us a huge discount. Any listener of Unregistered gets a 25% discount on any product in their store if you use the code RENEGADE when you go to palomaverdestore.com. On top of that, if you join their mailing list, you get another 10% off that order. So that's 35% off if it's your first order. Then, and this is very exciting for a lot of people apparently because it is sold, I think it's their number one product, it is their unregistered combo pack, which is simply my three favorite Paloma Verde products bundled into one for you at a huge 33% discount. So in the combo pack, which they call the Thad pack, you get their gummies, which come in both green apple and various fruit flavors, which I love and I eat them all the time. Like candy, but they also make me feel a lot better. You get their soft gels. And again, you can take these 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, depending on how bad people are pissing you off. And then my favorite, their tincture, their high potency tincture. I put a few drops under my tongue and it helps me a lot with my anxiety and my insomnia. So go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code RENEGADE, and change your life. Thanks. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so your article, the argument in it, the theory behind it does not come out of the blue. This comes out of many decades of scholarship, I think especially on Barbara's part. Can we, and especially your book, Racecraft, which I mentioned already, can we talk about the argument there about racecraft? I know you've talked about this a lot in the media, but it's so important and it needs to get out there. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show. It's a book I wish that everybody would read. I wish that everyone would read your articles too. Thank you, Adam, for showing Racecraft on the screen here for those of you watching on YouTube. Yeah, it's just so essential. And I got to tell you, I have friends across the political spectrum. I mean, I have friends from, communist to socialist to libertarian to conservative to everybody. And
that's unusual, Thad.
I know it is, and I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I need every single one of them to read your work. It drives me insane the way that they reify race, and in all forms of political discourse, pretty much every ideology is infected with it, but to some extent, I think, with the exception, I think, of if there are some good Marxists. The smartest Marxists are the only ones who are really good on this, kind of like you. And there's maybe, no, that's about it. So let's do this. Let's get this argument more out into the world. Let's lay out the argument in both your early work and in Racecraft. What is Racecraft? What are you angry about? What's the problem with this thing you're calling Racecraft? What's going on?
Well, let me start by being a historian, we always like to try to locate when something emerged and why it did. And my sister, Karen Fields, is the one who coined the term. And she was writing, she coined it in an article comparing the style of thought with which Western observers tried to understand witchcraft in what they regarded as primitive societies. And her point was, well, wait a minute, you don't have to look that far to find this kind of thinking, because the same kind of thinking, the same sort of circular thinking, the same sort of inventing the facts which prove the assumption which rests on the facts, and so on in a circle. And we had been working independently, and then we realized that both of us had come up with comparisons to witchcraft in trying to talk about racism. But she's the one who coined the term, and she told me that when she, shortly after she published the article, I think it was in an anthropological journal first, she went online to see, she Googled racecraft to see what would come up, and it was all about speedboats. Now, if you Google it, you might actually come up with our book.
Yeah, it does.
No concept.
NASCAR comes up for NASCAR.
Yeah, but it has to be said that we have developed the concept over time, so that at first it was our way of talking about the weird thinking, the weird notions of causality that you have to engage in if you're a true believer in race. But we've gradually had to think of it we've had to streamline the notion. And I don't even know if both of us have the same, have come up with the same thumbnail for it. But the way I explain to my students is that racecraft, reduced to essentials, is the process by which racism becomes race. Racism, though, I carefully tell my students, when I say it, I'm talking about an action, acting on a double standard that purports to relate to ancestry. I'm not talking about a feeling. I'm not talking about an idea, a disposition, an attitude. It's an action. And our argument is that the repetition of those acts based on a double standard purporting to come from ancestry eventually leads to an assumption that there are differences there that nature has made. In other words, it's not what we have done that has created race. Race was there, and then racism as a set of actions based on a double standard proceeds from that. So our first point was we wanted to reverse that notion of what comes from what. You have the action of racism, and out of that comes the fiction of race. And you can see that process going on again and again. I was just the other day rereading a recent book. I don't know if you've had Touré read on your podcast. You should.
No, but I know him. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you overlap?
We overlapped by just a bit.
Yeah. I had to read it quickly because I wrote a blurb for it. Then I wanted to read it again because I'm thinking of assigning it to my students. And although he doesn't use this term, he's actually talking about a process similar to racecraft when he discusses the way various thinkers, I don't think I'll mention any of our contemporaries, but in the past too, have decided that there's something so particular about Black people in poverty. They actually have it to Black poverty. Black poverty isn't white poverty. Well, that is, it's not only a reification, but it is racecraft.
Yes.
It is taking the result of the action and turning it into an ontology.
Yep.
And that's what his book, Toward Freedom, is about, because he comes up with an argument for why there is persistent inequality. And you can't really solve that problem if you're only looking at Black people.
Yeah. Can we,
go
ahead.
I was going to say, so one way to put this is if you think that racism killed George Floyd or Philando Castile, what's your explanation for what killed Hannah Pfizer?
Yeah.
Right. I'll double down on that. What's your explanation for the fact that there are about, right now as we speak, about 500,000 white people in prisons? What's your explanation that about 25 white people just last year who were unarmed were killed by the police? If it's a racist system. Last time I checked, there was not a single white person enslaved. There was not a single white person who suffered under Jim Crow, right? There was not real. I mean, they suffered sort of in a different way, but they weren't barred from space, and right, the way that African Americans were. Yet there's a hell of a lot of collateral damage here, right? 500,000 white people in prison just now, and 25 per year getting shot who are unarmed, right? For a racist project. It's never made sense to me on those terms, right? I mean, slavery and Jim Crow were obviously, by anyone's definition, racist projects that affected only people deemed to be Black or Negro, right? And now this thing that's just only portrayed as a racist project, the criminal justice system, has done untold damage, not to just the 500,000 in prison right now, but to millions since the 1960s in the drug war, the war on crime. White people, their bodies have been destroyed just as much as Ta-Nehisi Coates' famed Black bodies.
Thad, what is your response to the argument about proportion, that Black people are disproportionately killed, or disproportionately in poverty, or disproportionately incarcerated?
My argument is a class argument. So my argument is that Black people are disproportionately poor, and that therefore, and for some cultural reasons, which also have to do with class, I would argue, Black people are disproportionately likely to commit crimes. That's just a fact. You look in almost any poor area, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find more crime in poor areas. This is historically true. I also think, we'll get into this later, I guess, but I think there is lineage from slave culture that is resistant and oppositional to sort of the dominant culture, much of which I like and much of which I think is terribly destructive, which has led to also increased higher crime rates in Black, and again, this is about class, Black, what Robin Kelly would call working class or poor areas. And so cops, and then the third reason is that beginning in the 1960s, and this is the horrible untold story, Black political leaders led by the clergy. This is Michael Javon Fortner. I don't know if you're aware of his work. Michael Javon Fortner, the sociologist I think he's at CUNY, wrote a whole book about this. The Black political class beginning in the 1960s and 70s, including the Congressional Black Caucus, were the leading proponents for tough on crime measures because they wanted to lock up all the drug dealers in their neighborhoods, somewhat understandably. Yet what they gave rise to was Lyndon Johnson's Crime Bill of 65, and then ultimately Joe Biden's Crime Bill of 1994, which just locked up everybody. But what's not told is that the Black political class, not the Black working class, but the Black political class, mostly self-appointed, were pushing really hard for this stuff because they had middle-aged women, single moms who were couldn't walk down the street in Harlem without shots going off. So it's all understandable, but the solution they found was what we have today, was mass incarceration and disproportionately affecting Black people. What they got was more cops in those neighborhoods. And when you have more contact with the police, you're going to just simply have more arrests, more violent encounters, and more incarceration. So
there's also been a militarization of the police.
Sure.
Which has gone along with this process, and it's not just because the PMCs, as Adolph Reed, for the political managerial class
right.
of the Afro-American community. And you're right about their role in supporting these 3 strikes and you're out and so forth. But the militarization of the police is part of a process that has to do with the structure of our economy and how that has affected working people across the board. As you say, it will disproportionately affect those who are in low-skilled or unskilled sectors which have disappeared, where jobs have disappeared and so on. But it has led to a reliance on the military as an employer of last resort in some instances. And the so-called all-volunteer army, that's what they were calling it back during in the tail end of the Nixon days and later. I caused a scandal at the Wilson Center when Moscus, I don't remember his first name, the sociologist.
Peter Moscus.
Yeah, who was one of the originators of this notion of an all-volunteer army. And I caused a scandal when I said, all-volunteer army is a strange term to me. When I think of a volunteer army, I think of the Salvation Army. But what you're talking about is a mercenary army.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we have. We have a mercenary army.
Indeed.
But its influence has spread to the point and the notion that we use the military as a way of making up for the fact that we don't actually create enough work, enough jobs for everybody. And part of that militarization is the use of all kinds of the selling or even giving of surplus military equipment to police forces. But it's also had an effect on public language that, Adam and I have talked about this, that I find really disturbing. And I read just the other day, I saw an article in which the reporter distinguished between police and civilians. And when you begin to distinguish police from civilians, your thinking is already in the police state mode. The police, after all, are civilians. Why are we talking about them in contrast to civilians? Not only are they civilians, but they are the employees of the public that they are unleashed on with a license to do all sorts of things. If I could wave a magic wand, I would stop the journalists from using that language, because I think it inures people to the idea that the police are actually an army of occupation. That's how they function in many communities.
Yes.
And but we've naturalized it by using this language that essentially says they are an army that has jurisdiction over us as civilians.
I would just add to that by just saying that it just seems to me like the only language we really have in this country to describe a collective effort to do something big is war.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's a problem.
Guess what? You may be both of you may be aware that the United States is a superpower and a global empire. And
you don't say.
And you may have heard this. I don't know if you read the news much, but also has the largest military in the history of the world by far. I have said many times that, when you live in a global superpower of this dimension, almost all domestic questions end up being connected to foreign policy questions. And I think that's what Barbara was getting at in a sense there, right? The militarization of the police wouldn't have happened in Botswana because they simply didn't have a gajillion tanks to give over to the police. They didn't have flashbang grenades to hand out to every cop, apparently in every city. I mean, body armor and assault rifles and helicopters. Everything.
Apparently we have heat rays.
Everything.
Did you see that story?
everything.
Oh my. Anyway.
They've just been unloading the excesses, right, of our what our tax money has been going to pay for all these things to these damn police departments. Even small town police departments have this stuff. And we saw it in Ferguson. We saw it in Ferguson in 2014, right? It looked like a ragtag army, but it was still an army versus a bunch of kids with rocks and bottles and stuff, right?
And I remember reading comments probably in the Washington Post. This is some years ago. But it struck me, one of the commenters who was actually defending the police said, well, they have to maintain command and control. And he was speaking as someone with police experience. And that is straight out of occupation.
Yes.
That's a term that you use, that you develop as an army of occupation.
Yes.
And that has made its way into police training.
Yes.
So that they're using the concepts that have been developed in this country's occupation of one country after another, and it's coming back home. And I'm sorry to see it coming back home in a way that doesn't even cause friction when people hear this language, civilians, as though the police are entitled to authority over us. The fact that all you have to say is that someone didn't comply in some kind of tangle with the police, that's enough to satisfy many people that whatever happened was justified. Well, he didn't comply. She didn't comply. It even gets stretched to the point where somebody who shot in her own place, like Brianna Taylor, you can't say that she wasn't complying at that moment, but she must have been doing something before that warranted this sort of thing.
Brianna Taylor's
it's creeping.
Yes, I agree with all that totally. The Brianna Taylor case is a great example here. So Brianna Taylor was shot in her bed, for those who don't know, by a SWAT team in Louisville, Kentucky, who were executing a no-knock warrant that was given to them by a judge, and they went into the wrong damn apartment and shot her in her bed, thinking that she was the drug dealer they were hunting down. The thing is that happens to people of all colors all the time. No-knock warrants. I don't know how many states allow them, but many do. And this is one of the most outrageous things that police do. Any one of us, right? If that can happen to Brianna Taylor, you or Adam or I that could happen to us. The cops could get the wrong address and burst down our door at 3 a.m. and shoot us in our bed when we just show alarm.
And God help you if you actually, like so many Americans, had a weapon in your house for self-defense.
Right.
So when you heard the battering ram hit your door, you assumed that this was a home invasion, and then you pulled out your weapon.
Spoken like a true Southerner, Barbara.
Yeah, well, and this is what happened with Brianna Taylor, right?
Yep.
Her boyfriend had a gun.
That's right.
He thought they were under
right.
invasion, and he shot, and then the police killed her.
Yep.
But another instance and I was telling Adam about this the other day. It happened in Arlington, Texas, a few years ago. A young woman who had some sort of problem, we don't know what, but she was found lying in an alley, and people called 911 to ask for a welfare check. Would somebody please go and find out what is wrong with this woman? And of course, we've had one after another instance of welfare checks that ended up with the person who was being checked on being killed.
Yes.
But she was in an alley. Maybe she was intoxicated on drugs or alcohol. We don't know what. But the police officer who was sent to check on her was so intimidated when her dog...
I know this case.
Yeah, her dog approached him, a 40-pound Labrador Retriever mix.
I know.
And he said, get hold of your dog. And when the dog kept coming, he shot at the dog. He missed the dog, and he killed her. Mm-hmm. White woman.
Yep.
When I first read that story, it wasn't clear whether it was a white person or somebody else. But what was clear was that this was absolutely frivolous use of a firearm. And it was talked about, at least the story that I read, probably in the Washington Post, with all sorts of people saying, well, you never know, dogs can be, this, that, and the other. And others pointed out people who deliver the United States mail go to houses every day where there are dogs, some of whom are actually vicious.
Mm-hmm.
Many are not, but some are actually vicious. But there's no instance of a mail carrier shooting either the dog or a human being.
That's right.
They find a way to do that.
That's right.
Without having to kill somebody.
That's right.
We will make excuses for police officers who have to kill a 40-pound Labrador retriever and are not sufficiently trained in using a firearm to know that if you're going to shoot at the dog, you need to find out what's actually also in the line of fire. So along with this militarization goes a complete absence of training.
Yes. Well, we have a million law enforcement in this country, and that's a lot of people. That's a huge percentage of the adult population is in law enforcement. To get all those people trained efficiently, effectively, I don't know. It's a tough job. But you're absolutely right about all that. Adam, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you're trying to build a popular, democratic, small d, political coalition to stop this kind of thing from happening, why would you tell white people that it's never going to happen to them?
I know.
Like that they're somehow immune because of race.
I know.
That from
because of white privilege.
Oh, well. Yeah.
Well, then,
I mean, it's false.
No, but
and it's counterproductive.
I mean, Barbara, you're right, but I think Adam is asking why they dispense with that rational. I mean, why they dispense with rationality that would serve them? Why do they go to that white privilege thing when coalescing with people like Michael Bell Sr. or the family of the woman who was shot in Texas, or the guy who was shot in South Carolina, right? Why? Michael Winnell,
who was just apparently executed by the police.
Yeah.
All the time. Happens all the time. Why not? Why do you think? I mean, I don't know. This is sort of speculating, and it's maybe psychoanalytic. The answer is psychoanalytic or something. But why is it they're so resistant? Because when I raise this, of course, you're all lives matter, and this is you're a race. I mean, I've been called a racist for simply saying these things, right?
Actually, I mean, we got all lives mattered. Our article. There were critics who said,
"I'm sure
that's our position, or it's not."
I'm sure you really only care about white people, right? That's really what you're saying.
Yeah. Or that we don't care about anybody,
or you don't care about anybody, or you don't care about black people, which is obvious. But none of us care about black people here. But why do you think? I don't know. It's infuriating and
well, I can tell you one reason. This is public relations,
okay.
And that is that it has become such an easy response for corporations, for capital to just stick Black Lives Matter on their logo,
okay,
and then they've done something. And this goes back to a point you were making earlier on about that slavery has to be the explanation of everything, because that's the worst thing we can imagine. And the reason that's the worst thing we can imagine is that we don't talk about how vicious capitalism is. So slavery ended. Something else took over. But rather than an analysis about that something else, which was the consolidation of capitalist relations all over the country, we talk as though whatever problems we still have must be left over from slavery. Well, baloney.
Yeah. The fact
Bullcrap.
The fact that a huge chunk of black people are born into ghettos has a whole lot to do with what I would call state-managed capitalism that we've had. That's how I describe our economic system. But, the fact that they ran interstate freeways through cities so that they cut off the black neighborhood from the economically vibrant part of the city, which is in, Baltimore, Oakland, San Francisco, everywhere, on and on, right? I mean, the economic system as it's been arranged both by government and its corporate friends over the last, whatever, it's 150, 60 years, has left those people in that position. And that needs to be addressed. But
and Touré Reed points out that the real estate and big landlord interests have had a disproportionate influence, such that the policy that actually led to segregated suburbs and so on is premised on the notion of protecting property values.
Sure.
So once you assert that Black people living in this area will lower property values,
yep.
If you start from that premise, then all the rest logically follows. The denial of bank loans, the denial of FHA financing and so on, and the creation of segregated areas. And then you have a public, a white public, that will go along with you on that because you've told them this is the only way you can protect the most valuable thing in monetary terms, the most valuable thing you own, which is your house.
Yeah. And this is me channeling you. This is one of the things I learned from you. I mean, I learned it from you. It's easy and it's not real analysis. It's not actual analysis to say this was caused by racism, that was caused by race, period. I mean, I remember. So can we, Adam, you're about to say something though. I didn't want to cut you off before.
No, I think you're going sort of where I was about to go, which is to say that I think the discussion we're having right now, this for your listeners, who may not be trained historians or wondering what it is historians do or what they're supposed to do.
This is it.
Is that historians are supposed to explain why things happen the way they did.
This is it.
And there are structures of explanation for things that go on in American history that just don't do that.
Yeah.
And a kind of trans-historical racism is one of those.
Yep.
How does racism explain the Civil War? How does the same racism explain the rise and fall of Jim Crow? How does the same racism then explain mass incarceration, which is not something that originates at the moment of emancipation with the 13th Amendment, but flourishes much later for particular reasons?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I tell my students that racism actually explains too much because it explains why there wasn't a Civil War.
Yeah.
Right.
There was racism in the North and racism in the South, so there shouldn't have been a Civil War.
Yeah.
But there was.
Yeah. Right.
So then there must have been something else going on.
Exactly.
I mean, a corollary to that is that neither does whiteness explain the Civil War.
Sure.
Whiteness explains why there was no Civil War.
Yeah.
Because all those white people got along fine.
Sure.
But somehow they fought a brutal war against each other.
Yep.
How do you explain that?
Killed lots and lots and lots of each other, hundreds of thousands of each other. Yes.
Yeah.
With no problem.
Yeah.
All right. I want to get back into, so Adam and I are basically using what we learned from you, Barbara, just then. So I want to get into that. I want to get into your original articles that gave rise to all of this way of thinking that changed our lives and our way of thinking. Is it okay to talk about Alden Vaughn?
No.
Going way back.
No, because I didn't have that much to do with. He retired so soon after I arrived at Columbia.
Yeah.
Although he certainly had no sympathy with my argument, but we didn't argue face to face.
Okay. Well, okay. Oh no, I know. Well, I will talk about Alden Vaughn then. Okay. So I took an Alden Vaughn course when I was a graduate student. I thought he was a fine, decent guy, decent teacher, but you do have pointed critique for historians in your articles and in Racecraft, I believe. But and you have a footnote in which you use some of Alden's work as a prime example of this tendency among historians, as Adam was saying, trained professional historians who would explain things, especially like that racism caused slavery. Now, that is still Barbara, I don't know if you know this. This is still commonly believed in American society. That,
Yeah, I know.
I know you do. I know you do.
Well,
It's incredible.
People, they actually don't distinguish between slavery and race. There are people who use those terms interchangeably.
I call it the great conflation. It's everything gets conflated. So you and I and you sort of threw my head upside down too, because I thought, sure, of course, the reason why else would all those white people build those boats, sail them across the Atlantic Ocean to this land they don't know very well and are very afraid of, kidnap a whole bunch of people that they hate and despise, and then bring them back on those boats to live right next to them for eternity? Why on earth?
Yeah.
And your answer was, well, it wasn't because of that. It was more had to do with having to pick the cotton.
Yeah. I said, and
Amazing.
Probably even when you were taking my class, I said that the purpose of slavery was not to produce white supremacy.
Right.
It was to produce cotton and sugar and rice and tobacco.
Yep.
Corn and cattle and all those good things.
Yep.
And I don't know why that's such a hard conception for people to take on board. People understand it on some level, but then they always want to retreat to the notion that race accounts for it.
Yeah.
And I think in the article I said that using race that way is like saying that judicial review explains why the Supreme Court can declare an act of Congress unconstitutional.
Right.
That's the name of that,
Right.
but it's not an explanation of it.
Right.
You want to explain it, you have to go into the history
Right.
of the court and the country and how that came to be regarded as a power that belonged to the court.
Yeah.
But you can't explain it by its name, and you can't explain slavery by just calling it race or calling it racism.
Yeah.
But that comes so naturally to people that
it's incredible.
Go ahead.
The insight of Barbara's that always stays with me, and I try to explain this to my students, and they always look at me somewhat dumbfounded because I just can't explain it properly, is, we have this idea that the reason why we oppress people is because we think they're inferior.
Yes.
But Barbara says that in her essay, it's actually the other way around.
That's right.
It's easy to think of people as inferior if we're already oppressing them. Right. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, I try to convey this to students and people, and they don't get it. But as if you got a boot on somebody's neck, you can think of them as deserving of having that boot on their neck.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to think that way if that's what you're doing.
And if you have the power that allows you to do that repeatedly, then that means that those people are behaving in ways that accede to your power. They have to, because you've got that boot on their neck.
Yep.
But the fact that they repetitively accede to that power, that they surrender to it, eventually makes you think that that's the way nature intended them to be.
Right. So I want to go back again to your article, and another thing that I learned so much from, and I've cited every single year since 1991. We had chattel slavery in America up to the American Revolution and through the American Revolution, and many of the founding fathers are, of course, were infamously slave owners. Most people know that, I think. And they just say that, well, that's just the great hypocrisy of America, da-da-da-da. And you said, well, actually an important thing happened in that moment, or soon after that moment. And you were using David Bryan Davis's brilliant argument, that according to you and Davis, and now me for many years, racism as we know it now, like a coherent ideology, a machine, right, with many different parts to it that all work together and is coherent, was essentially invented right after the revolution to justify this damn thing, the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal, yet we own slaves. And Thomas Jefferson, in Notes on the State of Virginia, written after the revolution and after the founding of the republic, and many others following him, started to justify, as Adam was saying, having our boot on the neck of these people, because they didn't have to until then. When you have a country founded, when you're founding a country on this idea of universal equality, yet you're owning slaves, you've got to come up with some pretty nifty explanation for this. And that's what they did. They said, oh, you know what? Those people that we own, well, for these various reasons, Jefferson says in chapters, I think 44 and 45 or something like that, notes Stanley of Virginia, for all their hair color and their proclivities to leisure and their lack of industriousness and their over-sexualization, et cetera, they're not, when I said men in the Declaration of Independence, they weren't part of that, because they're not men like us. So they're actually well suited to slavery, and therefore actually we're doing them a favor. And
yeah, but the thing about Thomas Jefferson is that in that same book, he made it clear that he knew that didn't work as an argument.
That's right.
Yeah, he arrives at an understanding that this is tyranny. He actually refers to the slaves as citizens. He says that the slaveholders are essentially, that slavery allows one half of the citizens to trample on the rights of the other half. And this is at a point when nobody else, certainly not the law, considers them to be citizens at all. Remember, the Dred Scott decision said they're not citizens. Here's Jefferson in Notes on the State of Virginia referring to them as citizens and moral equals of their owners. So he knew it didn't work, but he couldn't reconcile the two things that he knew to be true. One was, we need slavery in order to build this country.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was, slavery is going to be the death of this country.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't work that way out.
Couldn't do it.
And you can tell that he's at an impasse, because at that very moment in Notes on the State of Virginia, he does something that's very unusual for him, which is he invokes supernatural interference.
Yeah.
He says, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he doesn't even believe in God, pretty much.
Right.
But he's like, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, and he never says anything like that again.
No.
Right.
He never comes back to that again.
This is a guy who actually
can't figure it out.
This is a guy who took a knife and cut all the miracles out of his Bible.
Of the Bible.
Yes.
But here he's invoking, divine wrath.
And he made the Jefferson Bible, right? His own,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally sacrilegious. Totally sacrilegious.
Totally.
Profane. Yeah. But do you? I mean, I and some other people, historians, credit, I guess, him with inventing scientific racism in this country. Do you do that?
Yeah.
You say that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, okay.
I say that.
Right.
But that's not the only thing to be said about Jefferson, and it disturbs me that too many people think that once they've said that, they've said everything.
They're done.
Then you can't account for why Jefferson had such prestige among the populists of the late 19th century. They would quote his work almost with reverence. Well, let's see what Mr. Jefferson had to say about this. And now that's not necessarily Jefferson, the actual person, but that is Jefferson, the figure, as he became part of American history. And I think it's a serious mistake to think that you can reduce it all to, well, he owned slaves and he slept with Sally Hemings. Maybe.
Right. Of course. Oh, yeah. We don't want to reduce him in that way either. That's not useful. He's an incredibly complex figure, no matter how you study him seriously. So, but back to historians and Alden Vaughn, who was a good guy, and we're not, throwing him under the bus here, but he and others were arguing at that time that slavery caused racism. And that was, I think, wasn't that the major prompt for you writing that essay?
Well, I don't say Alden Vaughn was.
No. But that historiography, that whole historiography that was portraying that relationship,
racism caused slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of what should I call it? Provocations.
Yeah.
Including George Frederickson Winthrop Jordan, who essentially argued that racism, in the sense of prejudice, had essentially been there forever. White people always had it. It's a kind of innate, an argument about innateness.
Innate and eternal too.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I was reacting against that, and I was reacting against the notion that that race is a biological reality, because arguing that, it effectively says that there can't be any history, there can't be any politics, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
And so in a way, you could say that the argument did not actually emerge out of a logical process of historical reasoning, because it started with, if this is true, then there's no exit. There's nothing we can do.
That's right.
I don't accept that.
That's right. Now, Barbara,
as a Marxist, I also accepted as almost axiomatic that human institutions start somewhere, and because they start somewhere, they can end somewhere. Frederick Douglass has a marvelous version of that, when he describes the process by which he came to understand how Black people came to be slaves. And he concludes it by saying that it wasn't God, not color, but crime, not God, but man. And then he says, what man can make, man can unmake. And I think that was the impetus. It has to be possible to unmake this, since we know it was possible to make it.
That right there is the root of political liberation, having that idea.
Yeah.
Right?
So we're losing it.
We sure are. Now, I need to ask you about something. I was a bit perplexed by something you did several years ago, although I think I might understand it now. You appeared on stage, I think this was in 2014 or 2015, with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he interviewed you about racecraft.
Right.
And at that time, Ta-Nehisi was not the same Ta-Nehisi Coates he is now. His argument. Okay, you're aware of this. So his arguments were different, and he quoted some of my work when he was writing in the Atlantic at that time. Ferguson happens, and then he reinvents himself and his argument. And I hope you know, like, his argument now is the argument of Alden Vaughn and all those historians like Winthrop Jordan you were talking about, which is that racism among white people is innate and eternal, that it's always been here and it will always be here, and that's that. It's, he's part of this what's called Afro-pessimism movement, literary movement. And so I don't know. I mean, I guess I understood why you were sympathetic to him at the time, because he wasn't making that argument then. But
I can't. Well, you can't say I was sympathetic to him at the time, because I didn't know anything about him.
Oh, okay.
No, Corey Robbins said, let's have a program, a conversation.
Okay.
And actually, it was that day that Ta-Nehisi Coates gave me a copy of his first book, which I still think is his best. It's called A Beautiful Struggle.
It is.
About his growing up in Baltimore, about his father, and shows a complexity of thought and analysis that I don't see in his later work.
Good, I agree.
But at that point, he was still looking. He didn't know. He hadn't arrived at conclusions. He was still searching, and he said to me at the time that he really felt a need to go back and finish the college degree that he didn't finish, because there were so many things he didn't know. That the certainty that he knew is something that has come later, and I have to say I think it's partly a result of the media reaction to him. It's dangerous to believe your press cuttings.
Yes.
And I think that may be what has happened. But at that point, we were talking about racecraft because just as I did didn't know mine. And Corey Robin told me that he had asked Ta-Nehisi Coates what he thought of my work, and Coates said he didn't know anything about it. So that's why Corey Robin thought we should get together and set up this thing.
Oh.
And I don't even remember what went on in that conversation. I gather there are films of it that you can find online.
There are.
I don't remember too much about it, but I think it was mainly he was trying to explore the argument.
Yeah.
And he said at that time that it had actually changed his mind, because he had assumed that race was, he didn't put it this way, an ontology, and that was that. And reading Racecraft had caused him to question that. Now he's pretty sure he knows what's what.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. If the Afro-pessimists and those who think that way are correct, then what's the point of engaging in any sort of political struggle? Because then what you're saying is there's never going to be anything we can do about this.
Right.
There's no way forward. We can't form a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a running argument with some of my best and smartest students about this, because they were true believers in reparations. And I asked them, well, how is that going to be enacted as a program?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say you want that, but you can't wave a magic wand and get it. How are you going to sell this as a political program to people who are not Black, and to Black people who don't actually believe? And the only answer is, well, we have to convince them that Black people are owed this. Well, that's not politics. You cannot convince people that I need to give up something that I consider to be mine, because 200 years ago, somebody who is thought of as my ancestor did this or that to somebody. You can't. That's not a political argument. You're not going to get anywhere with that.
Yep.
You can't build a movement like that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that Adolph Reed has been saying forever.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And what I like about Touré, his son Touré Reed's book, is that he goes through the processes that have consolidated inequality, class inequality, but also inequality as between Black people and others. He's gone through this as a political process and shown how it came about, what the arguments were among people in power during the New Deal, for example. He has an analysis of the Moynihan Report and reactions to it. And interestingly, when I was in graduate school, the Moynihan Report certainly did not have a good reputation among people who, not just on the left, but people who considered themselves in favor of progress for Black people. And suddenly not suddenly, but now the Moynihan Report has become almost a sacred relic for some of the true believers in this.
Yeah.
It's like the bell curve. It's one of those books that's been talked about for so long. One of those works, because it wasn't really a book. It's been talked about for so long that people think they've read it when they haven't.
Yep.
So they don't know what it actually is about.
Like the Bible.
Like the Bible.
Yeah.
Like the Constitution.
The Constitution,
like
yes.
the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. When I was in high school, a group of kids living somewhere in suburban Maryland or Virginia wrote out the Bill of Rights in longhand, and then they went from door to door in their neighborhood asking people to sign it, saying, this is a petition, we'd like you to sign it. And people told them, get out of here with this communist. That was a long time ago, and I tell that story because we should not feed ourselves the illusion that ignorance about the Constitution is something that just happened today or yesterday.
Oh, I think
it's been around for a long time.
Oh, I think substantial portions of the Bill of Rights are in definite jeopardy now. I mean, the ACLU is no longer defending speech the way it used to. I mean, it's a big problem now.
Well, if you've ever been on jury duty, you probably came up against, as I did, the realization that not only is there very little understanding of the presumption of innocence, but it's not the animating reality of jurors' decisions. I was on a jury where the prosecution couldn't prove its case, but its case was plausible.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who were on the jury with me, a plurality of them, continued to say, well, I think he did it. Mm-hmm. I think it happened this way. Mm-hmm. And there were 4 of us who kept saying, well, we're not here to say what we think happened. Mm-hmm. We're here to say what we think has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, regardless of what we think is plausible. Yep. But that's not an argument that people understand. Yep. And we've seen that again and again and again. How can we preserve the rule of law when such a basic principle as the presumption of innocence is so widely misunderstood, if people even know about it at all?
Let me ask you a tough question, and this, I actually want to ask it to both of you. As historians, especially, I think we become especially painfully aware of, the word has to be used, the ignorance, and that's what you're talking about, of Americans on political issues of all kinds, and in particular foreign issues, but I think all issues. Has that ever made you call into question in any way, in your own minds, democracy? Because these are the people who have power. These are the people who will elect people who will determine how your lives are shaped in many ways. These are the people who will determine whether we go to war or not. These are the people who will determine whether we have another New Deal or no New Deal, or, these are people who can pass drug laws, crime laws. They can make your life illegal. Has it ever, the ignorance, the gross, long-standing ignorance of Americans about political issues, affairs of governance, has it ever given you pause in your support for democracy?
It only would if I assumed that the people who would be autocrats are well informed. But I know that the ignorance is not limited to the popular masses.
True.
Who was it? I think it may have been C.S. Lewis who said that it may be true that some people are fit to be slaves, but nobody is fit to be a master. And that is the animating, for me, that is the animating argument for democracy. I do not, however jaundiced my view may be about the level of information of the popular masses. All I have to do is look at the people who are in government right now.
Sure.
To be disabused of any idea that people in power are better informed. They're not.
Not much.
And the fact that I don't suppose your audience heard this discussion. We were having it before we began. But the fact that you have an audience who are reading these things, listening to these things, talking about these things, not because they have to pass a class, and not because they're teachers or anything, but because they are curious and engaged, intellectually engaged. And as long as there are people like that, you can't tell me that the ignorance of the general public justifies authoritarian government. Because I know that however ignorant we are, they are at least as ignorant, they being the people who want to be up top.
Powerful argument. Adam?
President Bleach.
Yeah. No,
democracy up or down?
Democracy up. I mean, I'm Barbara. The quotation from Barbara is very similar to a quotation from Lincoln, who said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy.
Okay.
And say what you will about Lincoln, the guy did have a way with words.
Right.
Yes.
So I like that.
He did.
He did. So, the question is, and Barbara addresses this, if not democracy, who's going to rule?
Yeah.
Who's going to rule? And how are those people going to be chosen?
Yep.
Do they select themselves? I mean, are they self-appointed?
Yep.
And even if they're more informed, they're still going to be self-interested.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily going to rule in other people's interest. And which is at least something democracy may not guarantee that informed people rule, but at least they'll protect themselves. And I think that's actually an idea that comes out of emancipation and Reconstruction. Why extend the suffrage to these newly emancipated people who are completely uneducated?
Right.
And the winning argument was that it was for their own protection.
Yeah.
And I think that's powerful,
Speaking of slavery, so my answer, not that it's the final answer on this, is secession. I think this country is far too large and far too powerful, and it's a democracy in which ignoramuses rule. And so all I want to do is reduce the power that they have. And so the smaller the republics we have, the smaller the nation states we have, the fewer, theoretically at least, the smaller the armies they have, the less militarized their police will be, the less able they will be to invade other countries and do damage to us. That's all I got. I'm a secession.
Let me tell you what Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists said about those among the abolitionists who essentially made that argument. Said,
okay.
We just have to let the slaveholders go. We don't want to be part of a country with them. Let them go. And the answer that Douglass and other abolitionists made was, if you do that, then you will have no more power over the slaves than you now have over those who are enslaved in Brazil or Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And your secession will leave a lot of people who are not in charge of the parts of the country whose way of thinking you don't like, but they'll be under the power of those people with no countervailing force.
Yes.
There's no homogeneous area. I see this broached again and again. Well, just let the red states go. And that means letting a lot of people who are actually our allies, if not our relatives and friends,
mm-hmm.
go along with them and be under the power, the unchecked power of a leadership that is contemptible. I don't want to see that. I don't want to let South Carolina go. That's where my family come from.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want them to be under the jurisdiction of those bozos who are currently representing South Carolina in the Senate and who may be, even as we speak, protesting that they have a right to spread coronavirus wherever they want to, and nobody's going to make them wear a goddamn, no, I'm not going to say let them secede so that they can misrule the people under them.
Oof, that's another conversation we're going to have another time. So last question. I know Adam has to go. I do have some pushback on you on that one, Barbara, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
It is interesting that abolitionists, and there have been other kind of what you might call leftist movements, if you want to, we could debate that, but who have been decentralizers, who have, like the abolitionists for a long time argued state rights against the slave power.
I forgot that.
Yeah.
I forgot that.
You know?
Okay.
So not secession,
but the Supreme Court knocked them down.
But
yeah,
right. Can I just say this? Didn't they not then after the Civil War become essentially imperialists with Reconstruction? Wasn't the South occupied and then remade in the image of the North? Isn't that sort of classical imperialism? Like, didn't they do to the South what they then did to the Philippines 30 years later?
Well, who are they?
The North, the Union Army, and with abolitionists being the teachers in those classrooms, teaching.
So you are conflating the capitalist class, incipient in some cases, with the whole of the North. That means you have to forget that in that period after the Civil War, there were also labor uprisings, challenges to the consolidating rule of the capitalist classes, labor upheavals, and political movements designed to broaden the power of working people. So that was going on too, and
sure.
So I don't think you can conflate all of the northern states with those who had the most power and who were busy consolidating their power. And there's no question about that. There's no question that one of the things the Civil War accomplished and the Reconstruction amendments accomplished, not necessarily in line with the people who framed them, by the way. This is an argument Eric Foner has been making effectively, I think, for a long time, that it wasn't necessarily the framers' intent, but the Reconstruction amendments ended up doing more to aggrandize the power of the capitalist class than they did to protect the rights of the former slaves. That's not because they were written to do that.
Oh, I see.
But it's how it emerged.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Right. I'll have to revisit Eric's argument on that. Well, I want to talk about this some other time because I do think it was. I have said the South was the first Afghanistan. But can we? I know Adam has to go. I'm dying to ask you guys about recent developments in the historiography on slavery, and then I'll just let you go. I mean, we don't have to go too long on this, but the Walter Johnson is a historian who was at NYU. I think he's now at Harvard. Is that right?
Yeah. So Harvard.
And I wrote my book and I had my chapters on slavery. This was a good 11 years ago. Since then, I haven't really been immersed in that particular literature. But I did notice the emergence of Walter Johnson and this whole new school of thought that, as I understand it, was making a couple of arguments that neither of which I like and one of which I actually despise. One is the connection between capitalism and slavery, and this is really Adam's bailiwick in many ways. Well, it's both of you, but I think Adam wrote an entire book really on this. That's in some ways a little less interesting to me because it's actually more obvious that there is a connection and it's less controversial. The thing in the Johnson school of thought that really makes me crazy is their opposition to the idea of slaves' agency. Right? And Johnson has this book, I guess it's his big one about the expansion. I read chunks of it, and his descriptions of slavery are just they're a complete repudiation of the entire new left historiography, led by the great Eugene Genovese, still to me the greatest book, Roll Jordan Roll. I mean, without Genovese and Barbara Fields, I would not have anything to say about this era. In which, with Genovese and that whole generation in the 60s and 70s and 80s writing about slavery, they gave tremendous, that was one of the major points of that school of thought, was they gave agency to the slaves. The slaves created what's the subtitle of Roll Jordan Roll? The world the slaves made. They made their own world. They made their own culture against all the odds, against all the power in the world that was arrayed against them. And now, as I read it, you guys will know better, but it seems to me, and I've read pieces of this, and I've read reviews, I've read a whole roundtable in the AHA about it. It sounds like there's a school of thought now, or this is the dominant way of thinking about slavery. Is this true, that the slaves had no agency and the masters just, when they decided to expand into Louisiana and Mississippi and grow more cotton at higher rates, they just whipped them harder and punished them more? and the slaves had nothing to say or do about it, and had no ability to shape their world in any way. Am I characterizing that school of thought at all correctly? And what do you think of it?
Do you want me to take that one on?
Yeah, I'm going to let you start.
Yeah.
I have something to say about it too.
Yeah,
I'm dying to know what you guys think about this. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we could talk about the capitalism question too, because there's certainly an undeniable connection.
Yeah.
But the precise nature of that connection is what we argue about. And there's some interesting debate in there. And I think the new historiography has said that slavery is capitalism, full stop. And there's no recognition of any kind of tension or ambivalence or I don't know, friction between the slave mode of production and other sectors of the transatlantic and even global economy, which is where like the interesting stuff lies.
Okay.
I think with the question of brutality and agency, there is an image emerging in recent historiography of a ruthlessness. The argument is that slavery was more ruthless and more relentlessly ruthless, more all-encompassing, totalizing than
violent.
Previous violent, and that it's all violence. And that the previous generation kind of underemphasized the violence of slavery. In a way, it almost harkens back to this, one of the very first works of kind of modern post-World War II historiography on slavery, which is Stanley Elkin's
yes, it does.
Slavery thesis.
Yes, it does.
That slaves were infantilized and turned into a kind of Sambo figure.
Yes.
And the analogy there was to the concentration camp.
Yep.
And that's what comes out. So that's kind of returned. But I do think that there remains this creative tension between violence on the one hand and agency on the other. And you can find lots of examples of new historiography that does excavate those kind of livelier dimensions of slave culture. But there is a whole problem with the idea of agency to begin with, which is that nobody really knows what the hell it means.
Right.
And that it can encompass an incredible range of activity such that it becomes equivalent to just life itself. And that's not very helpful.
Fair point.
Well, and since a lot of it was inspired by E.P. Thompson.
Yes.
Although I have to say that that's another one of those books that people have heard talked about so much that they think they've read it when they haven't.
Making of the English Working Class.
Yes, the making of the English Working Class. And a point that Perry Anderson made in discussing it that I thought was really crucial is that agent is an ambiguous word in English because it can have two contrary meanings. On the one hand, it can mean someone who acts in his or her own interest, but it can also mean someone who acts on someone else's behalf. You're someone's agent. You're the one who acts for them. And Anderson pointed out that ambiguity in the word actually corresponds to a tension in the historical record, because both of those, whenever somebody says working people had agency, slaves had agency, the problem is not just that it's a blanket sort of statement. It's that agency can mean that you have the power to change things, or it can just mean you have the power to do things. And an example that Anderson gave was medieval peasants certainly had agency in deciding to get married or to have a child, but they had no agency in determining the population or the rate of growth and so on. So it's another one of those words that I just discourage my students from using it. Instead of using this word, let's talk about what you actually want to say.
Great.
And getting back to the totalizing institution, because that's how Elkins framed things. And for a long time, the historiography was in reaction to that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of my good friends, Sean Higginson, I thought made one of the most telling comments about that argument when he asked rhetorically, what was the birth rate in a concentration camp? Soon as you think about that, you see that there is a difference between slavery and these other so-called total institutions that it was being compared with. They have a different purpose, and therefore they have a different organization. I don't know which is, maybe I don't immerse myself in it, but I don't know which is the more troubling now. Is it the people who say that the slaves were just the targets of a whipping machine? Or is it the people who say that anything they did, even if it was just laming a mule or talking back, constituted an act of resistance?
Yeah.
Those are both really stupid positions.
Yeah, I don't like resistance either. I don't use that anymore.
Yeah,
I stopped using that a long time ago.
Yeah, well, and another one is community.
Yeah, I hate that.
I think Peter Colchin, I think adequately dealt with that one when he compared the so-called slave community with communities that actually did have the power to do certain things, the Russian Mirs. So, American historians have a way of picking up terms, picking up things, and then using them indiscriminately.
Yeah,
I think that's what. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say that if Elkin's analogy was to the concentration camp, the analogy du jour is prisons. That there's a kind of seamless continuity and unchanging transition from slavery to the contemporary prison system.
That's right.
But you can apply the same kind of argument that Barbara just applied to distinguish between the world of slavery and the world of prisons.
Different functions.
Different functions.
Fundamental.
Different organizations. They're different.
Yep.
And I think one of the tasks of historians is to disentangle those different historical formations and to show how they come to be in their own particular context.
So how do we get you two to become paid advisors to Ava DuVernay and Ta-Nehisi Coates? Because they are the major purveyors of these ideas, and they are running the whole show these days. I don't know. I mean, you just talked about those arguments that they're making. I want to say thank you. This has been food for my soul. I've learned a lot about things I have studied, as you know, for decades. It's great to reconnect to old Columbia friends.
Yeah, I'm delighted to see you again after.
Oh, thank you. It's been really wonderful. I'm so glad we did this. And you're both brilliant, and everyone should read everything you've ever written. And I've been telling this to all my people for a long time, but I'm going to say it again even louder. And just thank you for doing this. And I hope you feel better, Barbara.
Yeah, actually, I already feel a bit better. Let me just tell your audience that racecraft, there's an audio version of the book in the works right now.
Great. Are you and Karen going to read it?
No, we're not going to read it, but we're going to ride herd on whoever does. I
think you might think about reading it. I think you have a great.
Well, my sister actually wanted to do that, but
I think you should.
This isn't a moment to travel.
Yeah.
Which we would have to do.
Yeah.
And neither of us has a studio, or it's just impractical.
Okay. Too bad.
Yeah. So, but I would love to talk to your audience again one day.
That would be wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Dad.
Have a wonderful day. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.